My name is Amit Pal, and I am the Communications Director for the Freedom from Religion Foundation. It's so great to be here, and it's so great to be such a privilege and pleasure to be introducing this year's recipient of our Clarence Darrow Award, and that's Jamelle Bouie. Jamelle Bouie is, as many of you, if not most of you, must know, is a columnist for the New York Times. I was telling him backstage that my words of praise will be sincere because I'm a great admirer of his. I read his column among the first things when I open my copy of the Times every day. And he's had a really impressive roster of publications that he's written for before the Times. He was formerly chief political correspondent for Slate. He was awarded a writing fellowship for the American Prospect, a fellowship at the Nation Institute, then was with the Daily Beast, and then joined the Times as a columnist in 2019. He's been given several recognitions and awards, including from the Root publication, and recently received the American Political Science Association's 2025 Carrie McWilliams Award. At the Times, he writes about the, if I may say so, the predicament and the moment that we all are in. And as part of that, as a good portion of that, he focuses on the Constitution, democracy, state-church separation, the Supreme Court, and related matters. There's a quote that he sort of gave us or spoke when we interviewed him for our TV show that encapsulates what he's about. He says, to my mind, it seems that the court's conservative faction is on this mission to render the separation of church and state basically a nullity. Basically to say that, in fact, there's nothing in the Constitution that prevents state-sanctioned, state-funded religion or religious practices. I was fortunate to meet Jamelle, I'm not sure if he remembers, some years ago when I was teaching a course. I teach courses at institutions in Madison, and I was teaching a course at the University of Wisconsin. And the School of Journalism invited him to come and speak, and I was so impressed with his presentation and his answers to the questions that the students had. So it's so wonderful to be introducing him. And just a housekeeping reminder before I introduce the award itself, after our honoree speaks and takes a few questions, we'll have a quick stretch break, about 15 minutes, before re-adjourning in this ballroom at 4 p.m. for our final afternoon speaker, and that's Harvard professor Stephen Levitsky, whose book I'm using actually as a textbook in my course on democracy and authoritarianism I'm teaching currently. So I'll, of course, get that signed by him, and it'll be such a pleasure. Now on to the award. Our Clarence Darrow Award is a solid bronze miniature, not a replica, of the 7-foot Clarence Darrow statue created by sculptor Zenos Froudakis that FFRF placed on the lawn of the Rhea County Courthouse Centennial Celebration, some of you may have attended, in Dayton, Tennessee, where the Scopes trial took place. And this year, of course, was the centennial of the trial. The Clarence Darrow Award is one of only 20 statuettes we have created to date. It's an all-purpose award to recognize civil libertarians. Past recipients have included Ed Asner, yes, that Ed Asner, Representative Jamie Raskin, Eli Mistel, and 2 previous New York Times columnists, Linda Greenhouse and Michelle Goldberg. We are proud today to honor Jamelle Bouie for his brilliant commentary on the law, the Constitution, and democracy. And with us is none other than the sculptor himself, Zenos Froudakis, to hand the award to our newest Clarence Darrow awardee, Jamelle Bouie. Thank you.
Picture. Oh, I can't see it. So. It is heavy. All right. Thank you. Thank you so much. This thing is way heavier than it might look from your vantage point. I have 2 small children, and something tells me I got to keep it away from them. All right. This is such an honor. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here. It's such an honor to receive this award and be in the company of previous award recipients and also in the company of all of y'all who are doing such important work in fighting for the separation of church and state, fighting for the United States, not as some kind of Christian nationalist authoritarian country, but the United States as I think it was meant to be, a secular country with room for everyone, regardless of what faith they practice or what faith they don't practice, regardless of where they stand on the question of faith, that this country has a room for them in its civic and political and economic life. It's so fitting that we are gathered here this afternoon. The No Kings protests are ongoing. I see on my iPad here, I've been watching video feed. From around the country. I even had a No Kings hat that it's not polite to wear a hat when you're giving a talk, but it has a logo and everything. It's quite nice. And this is millions of Americans across the country gathered in our major cities, Chicago, New York, LA, smaller cities, little rural towns. I live in Charlottesville, Virginia, and I'm told that we have something like 10,000 people out of a metro area of about 200,000. That's a ton of people for the size of the place. So hundreds of thousands, millions of Americans gathered, not just to protest this administration's monarchical pretensions, not just to protest its illegitimate seizures of power, but to also stand for a vision of the United States which seems to be in decline, at least among our political elites who hold power. This is a vision of the United States that isn't a narrow place for a select group of Americans, but it is what Frederick Douglass called the composite nation, a nation that has room for everyone. It is a version of what MLK called the beloved community. It's a version of what W.E.B. Du Bois called abolition democracy. It is a nation founded on equality, founded on egalitarianism, and devoted to making sure that everyone who calls it home, and anyone can call it home, that's part of the beauty of this vision, has a place to make their life as they see fit. And I want to speak a little this afternoon about some of the people who oppose this vision, about some of the political figures who are currently arguing that the United States is nothing like that at all, that the U.S. is this narrow, restricted country for a select group of people. A couple months ago, our Vice President, J.D. Vance, gave this speech. Boo hiss. Thank you. I don't like that guy. Our Vice President J.D. Vance gave a speech at the Claremont Institute in California, and he gave a speech arguing against what he called the creedal vision of the United States. I'm going to quote him here. If you think about it, identifying America just with agreeing with the principles, let's say, of the Declaration of Independence, that's a definition that's way over-inclusive and under-inclusive at the same time. What do I mean by that? Well, first of all, it would include hundreds of millions, maybe billions of foreign citizens who agree with the principles of the Declaration of Independence. Must we admit all of them tomorrow? If you follow that logic of America as a purely creedal nation, America purely as an idea, that is where it would lead you. And he kind of goes on to explain that America, in fact, is a place with a defined heritage for a defined set of people. He has this really, it's a weird speech. He has this unusual line where he says that if you embrace the egalitarian values of the Declaration of Independence, this would lead you to exclude Americans who reject those ideals, even if they had deep roots in the nation. And so I'm quoting Vance again here. That answer would also reject a lot of the people that the ADL would label as domestic extremists. And he kind of refers to the Anti-Defamation League without explanation in the speech. It's just sort of, I guess the audience knows where he's going here. Even those very Americans who had their ancestors fight in the Revolutionary War and the Civil War, and Vance sees this as basically unacceptable. I think that the people whose ancestors fought in the Civil War have a hell of a lot more claim over America than the people who say they don't belong. as just sort of a quick critique of rhetoric here, no one says that the people who disagree with the values of the Declaration don't belong. It's sort of that kind of the whole point is that you can be here too. The point is that their vision, that idea, doesn't actually stand for the nation as a whole. But Vance's argument throughout this speech, and he goes after Zohran Mamdani as being ungrateful for issuing criticisms of the country. Vance's entire argument is that this is a country for a set number of people. A couple months after that, another Republican, along the same ideological lines as Vance, gave a speech to the National Conservative Conference in Washington, D.C. This is Missouri Senator Eric Schmitt. And he gave an even more explicit version of this address that Vance gave. So I'm going to quote from Schmitt here. For decades, the mainstream consensus on the left and the right alike seemed to be that America itself was just an idea, a vehicle for global liberalism. We were told that the entire meaning of America boiled down to a few lines in a poem on the Statue of Liberty and 5 words about equality in the Declaration of Independence. Any other aspect of American identity was deemed to be illegitimate and immoral, poisoned by the evils of our ancestors. Schmitt goes on to explain that his America is not an idea, it's a nation and a people with its own distinct history and heritage and interest. And he describes that history and heritage as such. We Americans are the sons and daughters of the Christian pilgrims that poured out from Europe's shores to baptize a new world in their ancient faith. Our ancestors were driven here by destiny, possessed by urgent and fiery conviction, by burning belief, devoted to their cause and their God. He cites a couple different groups: pilgrims, pioneers, settlers. He says they believe they were forging a nation, a homeland for themselves and their descendants. And he concludes that America belongs to us. It is our birthright, our heritage, our destiny. Now, I read this, and I was like, that, I feel like I've heard that speech in German before. It is so clear that Schmitt is describing a country by and for white Americans first and foremost. And even then, those white Americans who belong to a Christian faith as he sees it, which clearly is a kind of Christian nationalism, a Christian faith that is about the domination of others in the polity, in the country. And the thing about Schmitt's speech and the thing about Vance's speech is they both take aim at the Declaration of Independence. Schmitt's sort of dismissive 5 words is how he describes it. And it feels to be somewhat in an unusual place to be a person on the left, kind of standing up for Thomas Jefferson and standing up for the Founding Fathers and standing up for the Declaration of Independence. On the previous panel, I heard some discussion about referencing the founders. And I found myself in recent months really going back to the founding vision, not because it's perfect, not because it's not without flaw, but because it still stands for something significant and it still stands for something meaningful. And the Declaration in particular stands for something significant and stands for something meaningful. I think the best articulation of what that stands for came from Abraham Lincoln in the Gettysburg Address, which I recommend. I've read it a bunch recently, and I've read a lot about the Gettysburg Address and its construction and its conceptualization. And it's worth revisiting because it does stand as such a powerful rebuke to the Schmitts and the Vances of the country. But Lincoln says it best: 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. And Gettysburg was this consecration of this vision, this consecration of the soldiers who died defending the Union. Lincoln imagined a nation dedicated to the principles of the Declaration of Independence and the aims of the founders as he understood them. And his critics of the time, from Stephen Douglas, his political opponent in the 1860 election, to Roger Taney, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, the leaders of the Confederate Rebellion, all of them insisted that the society was not one of equals, but it was one of rigid and permanent hierarchies. Now, ultimately, the contest of Lincoln's day was settled by force of arms. It was not decided by debate. It was not decided by discussion. It was decided by, musket shot and cannons. But it's worth saying that Lincoln's vision, this vision of a country founded on an equal basis, this vision of a country that had room for everyone who wanted to call it home. There is a great line in a July 1858 speech that Lincoln gives where he says that everyone who comes to the country, if they look at the Declaration of Independence and they see we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and then they feel that that moral sentiment evidences their relation to those men, that it is the father of all the moral principle in them, and that they have a right to claim it as though they were the blood of the blood and the flesh of the flesh who meant it, of the men who wrote that declaration. And Lincoln says, well, then they are. That is the electric cord in the Declaration that links the hearts of patriotic and liberty-loving men together, that will link those patriotic hearts as long as the love of freedom exists in the minds of men throughout the world. So, Lincoln long believes that if you embrace these ideas, that you're as American as anyone else. And the army that defends Lincoln's vision of the country is, at the time, one of the most diverse armies ever assembled on the North American continent. It includes not just Anglo-Americans, but recent Irish immigrants, Black Americans, hundreds of thousands of them. It includes Mexican Americans fighting in the Western Front. It includes Native Americans fighting for the Union as well. A broad, diverse army fighting for an egalitarian vision of the country. And there's a great extent to which we now live in Lincoln's America, as much as anyone else's. And that makes it so ironic that it appears that the primary political project of Lincoln's partisan descendants, Vance, Smith, the President of the United States, is the destruction of this Republic of Equals in favor of a homeland for a select few. And I hate that word homeland because it sounds authoritarian. It has a vibe that I don't think really fits with what this nation is at its best. The 5 little words that Lincoln held up, but that Smith and Vance have disparaged, are a powerful touchstone, or have been a powerful touchstone, for some of the great moral and political crusades in our nation's history. And I'll just go through some of them. The women at the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848, they declare that they hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal. Frederick Douglass writes, the Declaration of Independence is the ring bolt to the chain of the nation's destiny. The principles contained in that instrument are saving principles. Eugene Debs declares that the Declaration of Independence recited the cause of the great strike for liberty. And one of my favorite reflections in the Declaration comes from King, who in a sermon he gives says, never before in the history of the world has a socio-political document expressed in such profound, eloquent, and unequivocal language the dignity and worth of the human personality. The American dream reminds us, and we should think about it anew, that every man is an heir of the legacy of dignity and worth. The Declaration of Independence, those 5 words stand for dignity and worth, the dignity of every person regardless of their skin color, the dignity of every person regardless of their ethnicity, and the dignity of every person regardless of their religion or lack of religion. Here it's worth mentioning, of course, that Jefferson, not a particularly religious guy himself, and so the notion that you sometimes see in Christian nationalist writings that Jefferson himself was trying to anoint a nation with God, it's just nonsense. It's bunk. Jefferson, for all of his flaws, his many flaws, his serious flaws, at the very least understood that the kind of self-governing polity that he imagined could not exist if it was torn apart by religious strife. And the figures that have carried forth Jefferson's vision have simply expanded that observation beyond religion to include all different categories of human diversity. Now, I'll say, going to sort of Smith and Vance's rejection of this idea, their insistence that America is a nation and a people with its own distinct history and heritage and interest. I'll say that a casual reader of American history will very quickly see a major issue here, and that is we do have a distinct history in this country, and it is a history of immigration and migration and the amalgamation of many cultures and traditions into something wholly different from its constituent parts. That the American heritage is this heritage of diversity, is this heritage of tolerance. This country has not just produced a vibrant secular movement, but has produced so many different religious traditions and denominations that all emerge from the basic impulse that, hey, I don't like what you're saying, so I'm going to go do something else. And that's part of the heritage as well, a rejection of established dogma and a attempt to build something new out of constituent parts. And what is true for our culture and identity is also true for our interest, if you want to use that word. The interest the United States has as a nation are those of a fundamentally cosmopolitan nation, a nation shaped at each stage by movements of people from around the world and the cultures and traditions they bring here as well. Smith, Vance, they are presenting their rejection of the U.S.'s cosmopolitan heritage, its secular heritage, its ethnically and racially diverse heritage as something new and novel, a new kind of idea, a new way of organizing things. But the truth is that it is one of the oldest visions we have in this country, and it's always been a kind of stale orthodoxy for people who believe in human aristocracy, for people who believe that you can rank humans according to some hierarchy, that some belong at the top and some belong on the bottom. One of my historical interests is simply those intellectual and political figures in American history who have been especially forthright defenders of white supremacy. This is a weird intellectual interest to have, but I find myself genuinely fascinated by reading the thought of those who do defend human hierarchy and seeing the kinds of arguments they make, which is part of why Vance and Smith and those around them are so familiar to me, because they just kind of sound the same. So if you were listening to George Wallace's 1963 inaugural address as governor of Alabama, you would hear something very similar when he starts singing his odes to the, quote, great Anglo-Saxon Southland. If you had attended a lecture by Lothrop Stoddard, who was the author of The Rising Tide of Color Against White World Supremacy and The Revolt Against Civilization, The Menace of the Underman, you would have heard something very similar to Vance and Smith. If you had joined the pro-slavery ideologue George Fitzhugh in the 1860s, you would have heard him explain that, quote, the Anglo-Saxons of America are the only people in the world fitted for freedom. You can see these ideas again and again. And the thing about these ideas, the thing about each of them, each set of them, is that they are comprehensively defeated by a vision of a more cosmopolitan and egalitarian America. Fitzhugh ends his career the devotee of an institution that's destroyed in the Civil War. Stoddard, who is a eugenicist, finds his ideas discredited by the Second World War and the Allied victory against Nazi Germany. George Wallace has a 5, 6, 7-year period of real national influence, but even that declined in the face of the civil rights movement and the emergence of a real national commitment to building a more equal America. So I think that Smith and Vance, like their fellow travelers past and present, are going to lose. They're going to lose. The thing to remember, though, is that their victory is not going to be, or their defeat, rather, is not going to be automatic. It has to be something that is part of a devoted and specific and dedicated political movement. That part of, I think, the task in this moment is to rediscover the values of the Declaration, rediscover the values of the Gettysburg Address, rediscover the values that are part of, I think, some of our greatest moments as a nation, and stand for them as strongly and as proudly as we can, and rebuke those that say that the United States is in some way just another country, just another place where those who belong according to some arbitrary measure are those who deserve to be on top. In the Gettysburg Address, Lincoln asked his audience to recommit itself to the great task, called the unfinished work, of preserving a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Smith, Vance, their fellow travelers, their allies, they believe the work has already gone too far. I believe the work hasn't gone far enough. And I think that today, this room, the events happening around the country are such a powerful reminder that millions of Americans also think we have so much work to do and that we're going to do it and that we're going to win. Thank you. Yeah, questions? Yeah. We have plenty of time for questions, so I'd love to take some from y'all, and I'll try to answer them as candidly as I can, knowing that I'm being recorded.
Just as a reminder, we do have Greta over there with the roving microphone if you're unable to come to this one. But we'll start at this microphone here.
Hello. Brilliant.
Hello.
Brilliant. My question, comment is, we keep saying Christian nationalism. I think it's beyond that. I think it's Christo-fascism, plain and simple. It's reminiscent of Nazi Germany. If we don't turn this around now, by the midterms, the game's over. Your comments.
A very good friend of mine, buddy of mine, has been engaged for years now in an argument with a set of writers and academics about what to call whatever it is that's happening. And he says we should call it fascist. They say we shouldn't call it fascist. It's been going back and forth for some time. And he recently wrote something that I thought was very smart. And he insists still that we should call this fascism. But then he also says, you know, whatever it is, it's bad, you know? Whatever it is, we don't want it, right? Christian nationalism, Christo-fascism, I have no particular, I'm not invested either way in what to call it. All I know is that it's bad, right? Is that it is a approach to the country, a vision of the country that is repressive and hierarchical and will ultimately lead to nothing but ruin for everyone who calls this place home. So it's sort of whatever folks want to call it, whatever pejorative they want to use, whatever descriptor they want to use, cool by me. As long as we can agree, it's not great.
I just finished reading last month a book that won the Pulitzer Prize back in the 70s, Jefferson, The Dark Side. And so Jefferson, had all these wonderful ideals and everything, the Declaration, but when he got to be president, he didn't follow them. He actually took the army and had it working against people along the borders of the country and on the rivers of the country, and the Embargo Act and all sorts of things. So do you think that maybe, I was thinking as I was reading this is what the people currently in power in the Supreme Court, they're looking back at Jefferson's experience as justification for what they're doing now. What he did in his presidency is justification for what they're doing now and limiting our rights and Trump, sending the military out to the cities to take over everything.
Yeah. I think I've always thought it's useful to sort of separate out Jefferson, the kind of political theorist, and then Jefferson, the politician, and Jefferson, the man in a lot of ways. Jefferson, the man in a lot of ways, is a very disappointing figure, is someone who during his presidency and certainly during his life did not live up to the values he espoused. But those values are still very powerful. And one of the things I've always found so interesting is that almost as soon as the Declaration was dry on the parchment, you had enslaved people referencing it to make claims for freedom. You had women referencing it to make claims for inclusion. You had, poor farmers leveraging it to make claims for greater economic opportunity. That regardless of Jefferson almost, the words themselves, the ideas themselves have resonated with people across the spectrum of human life and have been extremely powerful for that reason. And so I would, to a Supreme Court justice, to a politician who says something like, well, Jefferson decided not to spend some congressional funds, but Jefferson exercised authority he may not have had. I would say, first of all, Jefferson was criticized very harshly at the time for some of these actions he took. But that second, that the point of the Union, the point of the Constitution, is to form a more perfect union. And you don't form a more perfect union by going back to the mistakes that we made and trying to recapitulate them. You form a more perfect union by finding what was best and most worthwhile about our past and trying to bring that forward. So justifying what's happening now through recourse to past events, it's sort of like, okay, they did it in the past, and they were wrong to do it. But the things that we ought to care about are these ideals that can help us realize a better country.
I'm Diane Carlin from Florida, and I have asked a lot of speakers this. From your talk, it was very historical, very well delivered. I really enjoyed it, but I'm still thinking, what can I do? What can we do any different than letting this slide into total autocracy?
So how do I put this? As individuals, right, there's not a ton we can do, right? As individuals, we don't necessarily have all that much authority. Maybe if you have $1 billion in your pocket, there's stuff you can do, but for those of us who lack $1 billion, as individuals, not a ton we can do. What we can do collectively, right? We can do together as communities, as groups, as associations, and organizations like this one. And part of that is going to be advocacy work, right? It's going to be pressuring elected officials. It's going to be organizing to try to win political power. But part of it, and I think that this is a big reason why these protests today are so important, is helping others recognize that they're not alone. Part of how authoritarianism, autocracy, part of how it succeeds is by convincing people that it's already won, right? That you're alone and it's already won and there's nothing to be done. That this is all kind of a fait accompli and you will be living under this. And protests, especially mass protests, gatherings like this one, are a powerful reminder to the people who aren't participating, right? The people who aren't participating but might feel uneasy about what's happening, that they're not alone. When we see people warn their neighbors about ICE raids, when we see folks go spend time at courthouses to help immigrants who are being threatened with deportation, when we see people who look like us engaging in the work of a community, what you're not just doing the immediate work, you're also reminding everyone who's witnessing that like you're not alone, and there's power in numbers, and there's nothing about this that means that the game is over, as it were. So I'd say that the thing we can do as individuals is to continue working together as communities and continue doing political work as communities and continue showing up in spaces as a collective where we can demonstrate to others that there's dissent, that there's opposition, and that no one here is alone.
Thank you. My question, first of all, you hear it argued a lot that the Founding Fathers envisioned a Christian nation. And I guess I'm trying to figure out how best to respond when somebody says that. Is there some sort of a historical breakdown or a legislative history that talks about how many of the Founding Fathers were actually Christian, how many may not have been, in order to respond to those people who say, yes, they envisioned a Christian nation? How do you respond to that?
Yeah. I mean, my response to that has always been, there are two ideas sort of contradictory. First, that if you believe this, that the Founding Fathers wanted the United States to be a Christian nation, and then two, that they were too stupid to write that down, right? Like, that there are these great, amazing, demigod-like figures who definitely wanted the United States to be like a sectarian Christian nation, and then they somehow neglected to say this or write this down at any point during the 1780s and 90s. It's certainly true, and usually the response to this is like, well, they cared about virtue. They did care about virtue. We should care about virtue, but they didn't identify virtue with a particular set of confessed beliefs, right? They identified virtue with a broad set of practices, if anything else. To me, the easy answer is that if the framers of if the drafters of the Declaration, if the drafters of the Articles of Confederation, if the framers of the Constitution, if the first Congress, if any of these people had wanted the United States to be a specifically Christian nation, they would have, at some point, just written that down, right? And the fact that not only did they not write this down, but they wrote down sort of, they wrote the First Amendment, right? Like they wrote down, they wrote in a lot of ways the opposite of that repeatedly, to my mind is the clearest suggestion that like, no, did most of them attend some sort of religious service? Sure. Although I do think there's, for people who insist that the United States was meant to be a Christian nation, they're kind of substituting their notion of what, they're taking 21st century conservative American evangelicalism and then just like treating that as like Christianity. For a bunch of the framers, founders, these guys, yeah, they went to services, but like they were like the equivalent of a cafeteria Catholic, right? They did it because that's what you did, but they weren't necessarily people of like deep and pious belief. But even if they were, even those that were, recognize that they wanted the United States to be a place where, I'll put it this way, let me rewind a little bit. You will hear modern day reactionaries go on and on about Western civilization. America is defending Western civilization, et cetera, et cetera. And one thing that's interesting is that Americans of the founding generation and the subsequent generations, they would often contrast themselves with Europe, right? They would contrast themselves with the usual course of so-called Western civilization. They would say that here, we're doing something different. We're not doing what they did in Europe. We're not doing what they did in the United Kingdom. We have links to that. We have heritage there, but we are doing something different. And one of the different things they imagined that they were doing was not to have established churches, was not to have the kind of official religion that led to bloody centuries of sectarian warfare in Europe, which was not that far in the distant past for them, right? It was not that far away that this happened. So if you're encountering someone who rejects that, well, they didn't write it down, observation, then I would just point to the fact that these are people, they were intelligent men. They were aware of their history, and they were not trying to repeat those mistakes. They would repeat other mistakes, but not those ones.
I'm from Missouri, and I'm from Missouri, deeply ashamed of that right now. I read Senator Schmidt's remarks just a couple hours ago, and I immediately sent a letter expressing to him how deeply ashamed I am of him and of being in the same state. And I would encourage all of you to let him know what you think. So please drop him a note.
I agree, you should do that.
We are out of time for questions, so thank you so much.
Thank you. It's a real honor. Thank you so much.